Hello, welcome.
Hi.
This is Leanna and Ashley.
And you're listening to Cove Corner, where we talk about race, feminism, and other shit. Welcome back to Cove Corner. This is Ashley.
And Leanna.
And this is episode 2. In this episode, we're going to switch things up. So if you follow along on Instagram, you saw that we picked our book club pick for the month of September. It's called Wandering in Strange Lands, A Daughter of the Great Migration by Morgan Jerkins. And we are going to be discussing this book in this episode.
I am super excited to talk about this book. Before we get into it, though, I do want to mention a trigger warning. There is some mentions of police brutality that we're going to be discussing in this conversation. If you see the title of our podcast, you know that we do talk about feminism and race, but just wanted to have an added trigger warning for the police brutality. As well, Morgan Jerkins is a American author, and so she refers to the Indigenous folks as Native Americans. I know here in Canada we use the term Indigenous, so Ashley and I might be going back and forth between Native American and Indigenous, and that is why.
All right, let's get into it.
I'm actually really excited to talk about this book. I really enjoyed it. I've never read a book that was laid out like this before, as we were saying earlier, and yeah, I think I found it to be really interesting.
Yeah, I will say that this is the first book I've ever read, I'm pretty sure in my life, where someone goes back and explores their ancestry and literally travels cross-country to actually see the locations and meet the people in those places to try and track where they come from. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend this book to anyone interested. And this is Morgan Jerkins' second book, and it's very different from her first. Her first was really amazing, and I think the first was more so essays about her past and just talking about her experiences as a Black woman.
More of a memoir.
Yeah, more of a memoir. But this one definitely dives deep, and you will definitely learn a lot more about American history and those that were omitted from it.
And after reading the book, we kind of discussed that we noticed there were some overarching themes. So she divided the book into 4 sections based on the different states and cities that she was visiting. But each section kind of covered something. So we noticed that in part 1, she spoke a lot about Black culture and traditions. In parts 2 and 3, got more into Black history and ancestry. And then the book finished off talking about oppression and police brutality and kind of modern day issues that are still happening.
Yes, the book definitely finished off with things that are still relatable, unfortunately, in 2020. And if anything, at the very end, it highlighted how, in a lot of ways, how far we have to go and how little we've come.
At the start of the book, she started talking a lot about her family lineage and culture and understanding different traditions and where they came from. And one of the things I really liked was when she spoke about watering a tree when it comes to your ancestry. And basically, you don't just water one side of the tree, which is to say it's important to get to know both sides of your family. And it got me thinking a lot about my own family lineage. And I'm wondering if you know anything about your family lineage. I don't know all that much.
Okay, so for me, my whole life, I've considered myself very Canadian, but both my parents are from Jamaica. They were both born in Jamaica and then both immigrated to Canada at different times in their lives. And so I always get the question of where am I from? What's my background? And I always say I'm Canadian, and then people obviously pry more, and I say I'm Jamaican. And they assume that I'm mixed just because I'm light-skinned. And I say, no, both my parents are from Jamaica. And that's when they kind of like eyes glaze over because it's like a boring story. It's not some exotic mix. But I will say this, that I want to say, I think about 5 years ago, my dad randomly told me about his grandfather, so my great-grandfather on his mother's side. So he worked, I think, in the government in Jamaica. And I have a book at home on him. And it just talks about like the family line, and at the very back of it, I remember seeing mine and my brother's names of the ancestors like going down like the grandkids. And so he worked in government, and actually he met Martin Luther King Jr., Haile Selassie, and the Queen of England.
Wow.
Like he presented, I think, keys to the city to Martin Luther King and Haile Selassie, and I think he presented gifts to the Queen of England when she visited Jamaica. And it was a random, like my dad just randomly mentioned it about 5 years ago out of the blue, and then gave me this book with all this information.
Wow.
So I think that's probably the closest I've ever come to Morgan Jerkins, like, understanding, but it's a very small part of my ancestry. Like, it's only one side of my ancestry. But I remember at the time thinking, like, okay, so this is a cool fact about my ancestry, but what about the other side of me, like my mom's side, which is not as informative. Like, I will say that both my parents came from Jamaica. My mom came from closer to Montego Bay. My dad is from Kingston. My dad was well off. Like, they had like maids in their house when he was growing up. My mom comes from the country, so she comes from a not as like, she comes from a poorer background. And so it made me think, I mean, in the moment, I think when I found that out, I was very interested to hear more about her side. But it's interesting to think that when you're living your life, sometimes you don't think about the legacy or what you're going to leave behind or the stories you're going to tell to your kids and your kids' kids. And so when you're just trying to survive, you don't really have the luxury of doing that. And so I don't know, even if I did research now, I don't know if I'd ever actually find out about my mom's side, because that wasn't something that they took the time to do, because they were just trying to survive and thrive and provide for their families.
That's super interesting, though, and cool that there's a book about someone in your family.
It's in my closet.
I do not have access to information like that. I mean, I know I can trace back basically to my grandparents, and well, actually my great-grandparents on my mother's side. I had the privilege of being able to meet them, but other than that, I don't really know much about my family history. My dad is from Portugal. My mom was born in England, but she's Jamaican and British, and so that's about as much as I know. I know my dad had, I think, 7 other siblings. His father passed away when I was really young, but I did get to meet him, and yeah, that's really it. I've had the privilege of getting to go to all the countries that my family's from. So I've been to England, I've been to Portugal, I've been to Jamaica. I've met some family there, but it's also probably some ignorance on my side, or just the lack of taking the initiative to actually ask about my family history. But after reading this book, it's really got me wondering about what potential stories could be in my family, and I really want to sit down with my grandfather and ask him questions about where he's from.
2 things to add to that. I would just say, first off, I think it's amazing that you met your great-grandparents. I've only ever met grandparents, but all my great-grandparents have passed away by the time I was born. But also, I had the same feelings of wanting to go and search out things. But it's interesting because before this, I would say the trend of wanting to know where I'm from would just be to take an ancestry or what's the other one? There's another one.
23andMe.
Yeah, the 23andMe test, and then get it back. Just to be like, oh, I'm this percentage, whatever. But it's so interesting because I feel like this book has more depth than that, and just instead of just getting percentages of what you may or may not be, because apparently those are not 100% accurate.
No.
I really appreciate this instead, and more so, I've been meaning to do a 23andMe for the last maybe 2 to 3 years of my life, and just never found the time or never been convinced enough of spending that money on it. And now I understand why. It's because I wanted something that was deeper.
Right. I like how she talks a lot about other types of traditions in Black culture and the importance of food and communal eating, and the fun fact of how, well, not fun, I guess, but just the fact of how communal eating in Black cultures came from slavery, because back in slavery times, every Sunday, that is the time that slaves actually got to gather together. And so they'd come together and they'd have meals together. And that's a tradition that got passed down for generations. And now there are a lot of Black families who do get together on a regular basis. More modern day, we start calling them cookouts, but those types of things still exist. And it came from slavery, which I found really interesting. And my family used to have a lot of family gatherings when I was young, but it kind of stopped once we reached a certain age, which I guess is to be expected. But one thing that stood out for me too was the fact that she didn't know how to cook a lot of her cultural foods, and I don't know how to cook any of my cultural foods. And I'm wondering, is that a thing for you as well? Like, do you have a connection to your culture through food with your family? Do you know how to cook certain meals?
No to the cooking certain meals, but 100% a connection. I have memories of my grandmother cooking, and my mom, who cooks a lot of different food from Jamaican meals, but the one big thing was oxtail. And so it was very interesting. In this book, she also talks about how the Great Migration led to soul food traveling through the country. And that's how people were able to kind of reconnect with their cultures and their original homes. And so it's interesting because oxtail for me is something that I'm obsessed with, but it takes a lot of work to do. And my mom makes the best oxtail in the world. So
my mom makes a good oxtail soup.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, my mom's is a stew, and it's amazing. It's my favorite. But something that's really interesting, like, going back to the slavery and Sundays, is that there was not a lot of access. They didn't have any money, so they would just do with what they had. And so oxtail really is like, it's literally the tail of the ox.
Yeah.
And some people will turn their noses up to that. But interestingly enough, in my lifetime, my mom used to make oxtail way more frequently in my childhood because it was cheap.
Yeah.
Like, the meat was not as expensive. But now that mostly, like, it's become a trend in other, like, in white cultures specifically, it's more expensive, and it becomes more of a holiday thing. So now it's like a Christmas tradition. She'll do it mostly for Christmas or Thanksgiving. And so it's very interesting to see that things that years ago may have been turned, like, people would turn away from them and think it's disgusting, has now become some sort of food trend. And it's like something that people almost, I would say, appropriate in a sense, and they don't really realize the history of that. So...
Yep, I can think of a few Toronto restaurants. Not gonna name names, but the food's really good. But yeah, appropriating the culture for sure. Yeah, and some other things, I guess, when talking about the culture, was the whole root work and magic and spirituality and voodoo even, and all these mentions of types of beliefs and religions within Black culture. And I found it really interesting how once Black folks were colonized, these beliefs kind of got diluted a little bit and mixed in with Christianity, and Christianity is a big part of Black culture still today, but there are people who still hold on to these traditions with traditional medicines and root work and things like that. And I just found it so interesting, and how she talked about how voodoo is seen as this evil, weird, kind of witchy thing, but if you're taught about it properly, you can see that there's a lot of cultural significance in that.
It's true. I feel like it's definitely something that evolved through time, and was one of the things that was one of many things in Black culture, in different Black cultures, that was lost as Black people were forcibly moved across North America. But especially it's interesting because if you think about it, like, way back, Christianity is from Europe. That was brought to Africa by Europeans. And now, I mean, there's a lot of obviously Black people who are Christian, but the spirituality and being connected to nature and turning to those things for problems as a problem solver is something that was innately African. And it's very interesting that over time, that was the thing that some people clung to, but also some people pushed away from because they wanted to assimilate and be more quote unquote normal. And it's very interesting because for me, like, to relate it to my life, my mom is a very natural person. She doesn't use, like, I swear, like, she uses she has the simplest skincare routine. She's always been very natural. She's always promoted eating, natural things and using natural products. She has literally a rock of shea butter underneath her sink in the bathroom. That is what she uses. Like, not the lotion that has, quote unquote, has shea butter in it, but like the actual rock of it. And I'll never forget that when I was in middle school, I almost broke my ankle, and it was a really, really bad ankle twist. And I was about to go to Quebec with my classmates, and my mom insisted on going to get mud, to put mud on my ankle every day to help heal it. And I kid you not, it healed like really quickly, considering how severe the injury was. And I'll never forget that because I was embarrassed, but it actually helps. And so it's one of those things where now I'm like, oh, like, maybe don't look down on that. Like,
right. And so funny too to feel embarrassed, because as you would when things like that are not seen as quote unquote normal in everyday white society.
Like, the main culture really does overpower everything that you maybe believe that's differently. And people always say to my mom, like, oh my gosh, you're glowing and all these things. And I'm like, if you only knew the simple things that she uses and how much money you would save, my child, you would be thanking me.
Right.
Like, I get a portion of that money that you're saving every year, spending on all these other things, just because there's like a belief, or as a society, we've kind of like, we're entrenched in that culture.
Yep, it's very true. Do you have any other points for the first part of the book?
I would say there's also mention in the first part of the island that she's on. I think it's in Georgia. It might be South Carolina, though. And there's people who migrated and left behind their homes, but there's also people who stayed behind on this ancestral land. And just throughout the book, there's so much repetitiveness of this, of white people or governments seeing this land as being worth something, but always through money. It was worth this amount of money, and therefore we needed to get these people out of here so that we could claim the land. And so just the many different ways that they were able to do that. And so talking about, like, you know, all these on the specific islands, it's really beautiful. So it became a bunch of resorts and a lot of gated communities for predominantly white people, and not welcoming spaces for the people who had been living on this land for how many years. And on top of that, too, there's one person in the book that Morgan talks to who says that she's actually applied to hotels as a child care worker.
Right.
And has been pushed to being just a housekeeper. That's what the role that they want her to be, is a housekeeper, because they don't want her to be on the front lines. They want her to be behind the scenes. And it's just so interesting. It's like you take the land,
but you want to hide the culture and the people.
Right? It's so bizarre. And there's no acknowledgement of that, too. And it's something that I think, like, I just think back to my history classes over the years and at, like, public school. And I'm just like, wow, I learned like 5% of what is there out there. And I learned the highlighted and the version that they want me to know, and not the real history.
Of course, like, our history books are completely colonized and whitewashed, and especially also here in Canada, this entire history of Indigenous people, and even recognizing the fact that slavery did exist in Canada as well. Not many people are ready to have that conversation yet. Everyone assumes that it's just in the States and in the southern states, but the truth is slavery happened here as well, which is mentioned a lot in the second and third parts of the book, where they talk more about Black history and ancestry. And one thing that I found really interesting as somebody who is biracial, and I know as a light-skinned Black woman could relate to that whole section of the book, just talking about having light skin and being white passing and the privileges that come along with that, but also the racism because your Blackness is denied, and this whole idea of, you know, what are you, and you have to be one or the other, and this whole complicated mess.
It's just my life. Where are you? Where are you from? Oh, really? Oh, are you sure? No. Actually, are you sure? A year ago, a guy told me, "Are you sure you're not Indian?" He's like, "Check your DNA." He told me that. Like that.
I mean, I get Indian all the time. I get Indian or Pakistani. I get Latina, but people don't know from where. They just assume I'm either Spanish or South Asian. And when I tell people my background and they hear Jamaican, I always get, "Oh, well, I knew there must be something in there." As if, like, what does something mean? And what do you mean in there?
In where?
Like, I am. But it took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that you could probably hear my cat meowing in the background. He's super annoying. It took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that I am a multiracial person. I am Portuguese, I am Jamaican, I'm Canadian, I'm English, I'm white, I am Black, I have colonizer blood in me, I have the blood of the people who are being oppressed in me, and that was something that was really difficult to come to terms with.
For me, it's the fetishization of mixed race people, especially everyone's like, "Oh my God," like, you know, those sayings that your kids are going to be so cute. And there's this obsession. And so I think that's part of the reason why people are so fascinated with my background and where I'm from, because they assume that I have a Black parent and a white parent. Like, that's just what they think it is. And so when I say I'm Canadian, because I just feel like I am Canadian, I've lived in the same neighborhood my whole life, glaze over. And then they're like, "Oh, well, like, no, but your parents." I'm like, "Jamaican." And they think, "Oh, no, like, your other parent." And I'm like, "Also Jamaican."
Whereas I have the opposite of that, where I am the product of white and Black people. So I get fetishized all the time. And I have this thing of like, "Oh, you're so beautiful because you're mixed." I literally get people saying, "Oh, well, like, you're mixed, so you're hot." As if that's the only reason that somebody could be attractive. And it's just a really awkward, annoying conversation to have with people. And, you know, people questioning about what my hair must look like, or just I don't know. It's really ridiculous and annoying.
Oh, it's very interesting for me when white people do that to me, because I'm like, unless you are an indigenous person, where are you from? Because, honey, this is not your land either.
Literally.
Like, you don't see me asking, like, you know, what small English town your great-great-great-grandmother lived in. So don't ask about mine.
Exactly. And one quote that I like I'm just going to read off a quote from the book about this, is when she said, when people assume, they inadvertently erase others' identities. So it's like when people are assuming that you have white in you, they're taking away the fact that you are a Black Jamaican woman. When people, you know, assume that I'm Spanish, or they assume that I'm Indian, and people don't take the time to actually get to know who you are and where you're from, they're erasing a part of you.
Yeah. And they're not trying to see the whole picture. They're just trying to see the fetish, what's the word? They're just trying to see one part of you, and it's almost like entertainment. Like, oh yeah, like I knew it. Honey, you knew what? Sometimes I'm just like, what? I'm sorry, I'm very confused.
Yeah, so white people always need to be validated.
I'm not gonna lie, in the last like year and a half, I've literally had no tolerance for it, and I was almost gonna start saying, to the answer to where are you from, say my mother's vagina. Would you like to know more? Because technically that is where I came from.
Right? I can give you the whole birth details.
Honey, she
if
gave
you
me
like.
details. So you want to know, let me know.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done that yet though, so we'll see if it works.
Tell me how it goes. But connected to this too was the conversation about the Black people in America who were mixed with indigenous culture, and how white folks started to colonize indigenous folks in America. And you know, obviously indigenous people were forced into Christian schools and Catholic schools, but it was also used as a form of diluting their culture in hopes that they would turn away from Black culture, or they wouldn't want to be connected to Black culture, because God forbid two minorities band together and fight against the white people. And so there was this whole thing of trying to segregate the two and colonize both of them while still keeping Black people enslaved. And, you know, during the time where indigenous and Black folks were enslaved together, and they had babies, these children were then denied things like healthcare, because, you know, if you're indigenous, I guess you had access to healthcare, and they didn't want the Black folks to have access to healthcare. So I found all of those things in the book to be really interesting and troubling, obviously.
Yeah, it's like you can only have one label. Like you could either be indigenous or you're Black. And in a lot of it too, from the white people's perspective, they couldn't speak the languages of the different tribes, and so therefore when they were trying to denote what someone was, if you look like you're a Black, you're a Black. Didn't matter. If you were an indigenous person that was like white passing, then in some points in time you were considered white. It was very like, it was just, there was no question, there was no asking, there was no information gathering. It was just assumptions, which is very, very, it's interesting because it's very prevalent now. People just assume things about you, and that's it. I think they need to put you in a box. Yeah. And you can't climb out of that box. You can't be different than that box. And if you are some way, you're an other, an outsider, or you're in a way almost like attacking what they think of the world. And like they're, if anything, you're attacking their small-mindedness. Yeah.
And all of this just highlighted too the importance of solidarity between indigenous and Black folks, and really the continued solidarity that we do have, especially right now during the present BLM movement and all the terrible things that are happening to indigenous folks across Canada, or Turtle Island, I should say. It's just wild to think that white folks have been trying to take away that solidarity since the beginning of time, basically.
Yep, and it's 2020. When people ask you why, or people say, you know, it's not that bad, or when did this happen, you also have to realize you're like looking at history through a white filtered gaze. And another thing to do with the mixture of indigenous folks with Black people is the Creole culture, and how you know, Morgan says that there's, I think, rumors in one side of her family that there's Creole, and she just assumes like, okay, no, because everyone says that. And then she learns that, you know, there were times in history then, yes, that indigenous people and Black people were together at certain points, and so yeah, that's very well could have happened that people, you know, got married and had kids, and then those kids were both Black and indigenous. And so but also I can understand the other side of it is the fact that, like, if these people were lighter skinned, like lighter skin in Black culture has always been something that people want to obtain. You know, like lightning creams. There's like a whole other history there. And so I can also see the side that she talks about that there was an assumption. I can understand both sides, but there's an assumption that Creoles thought that they were better.
Yeah.
And that they were quote unquote uppity because they were light skinned and better than. And this indoctrinated racism from the beginning of time has really just made people of all times in the past of history, sometimes they try to revoke their blackness, but other people are just trying to feel connected to who they are. Yeah. And so I can only imagine how hard it was if you were part Creole or part and if you were indigenous but also black, and people weren't allowing you to be both. Because you had, in the book she talks about, there's people who were, I think, Cherokee, who were denying people who were trying to say that they were indigenous, which is very interesting. So from both sides, it's like black people are like, no, you're not really black, and then indigenous people are like, no, you're not really indigenous. So it's like, I'm a question mark.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
And that is a struggle that a lot of mixed and multi-racialized people have today still, I think.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who has like literally a couple, actually that whole thing with my grandfather or great-grandfather started the question that this is why I have this note on my phone from years ago. And it's like, I learned on both sides of my family, between both of them, I have German, I have Italian, I have black, I have British, and I have Scottish. I don't know 100% if those are factual, but from my parents know on both sides. And so it's like, okay, yes, I am black, but there's also like white in me. I'm sure there's colonizer in me too. And trying to figure out like how and why and where I'm from and why I exist, and being able to exist and acknowledge that and understand what that means.
Yeah, very heavy topics.
Yes, colorism is real, people.
It really is.
If you don't know the term colorism, I do ask you to go to Google and do some research and read some books.
Yeah, and that's all the notes I had for part 2 and 3 of the book. Was there any other points that you wanted to discuss?
There was one part too. This also relates back to, you know, people who have who identify with multiple different cultures and ancestries, and that is the fact that some people just believe, or some black people just believe that people who were trying to say that they were also indigenous were trying to distance themselves from slavery, which is something to think about, because slavery is such an atrocious part of our history that is still not acknowledged to this day. Yep. That I can imagine, you know, the people who lived it obviously wanted to get away from it and wanted their kids to live better. And I feel like that happens every single generation. You want better for the next generation. But I can also see the people who just want to know who they are. And also if they see that one parent is black and one parent is indigenous, that's who they are. Like, they came from that. So
it's fair to want to get to know both sides.
Exactly. And it's fair also to want to claim that too, because you can't just be like, I'm only black from my dad's side, say.
Exactly.
Instead of saying I'm only indigenous from my mom's, like you have, like, you're both, you're a mixture of both, and that's beautiful too. But yeah, that was, I think, it for me for that third section of the book. Honestly, guys, this book is very dense and very intense, but it was so beautifully written, and I think it was such a beautiful journey to witness of someone I don't know. Like, I want to know Morgan now. Like, I want to be your friend, because I'm like, oh my god, this is amazing. How did you come up with this idea?
How did you trace back 300 years as well? It's a lot of work,
right?
But it's really easily written too. Like, the topics are heavy, and but it's written in a way that it's digestible. Like, I didn't feel like I was reading a history book, and I didn't feel like it was something that was stressful or too difficult to read.
Yeah, so if you're having a hard time in 2020, this isn't a heavy book to read. It's just, I think you're going to learn a lot. Yeah. And I think it's going to make you want to either, or maybe both, go search out your own history and ask questions if your parents or great-grandparents or great-grandparents are alive, or aunts and uncles or extended family. But I think it'll also make you want to search for resources that tell more stories of history, because I think it'll highlight the fact that as a society, we learn one version of history, and it may not be the whole version. It's omitting a lot.
And then the end of the book, she starts talking about herself and her own migration, and when her family migrated to LA, and a lot of the things that had happened in LA during her family's time migrating there and leaving, all around revolving around oppression and, unfortunately, police brutality. And one of the first things that she mentioned in this last part of the book was how black neighborhoods are perceived in TV. and also how Black folks were purposely not rented or sold houses in certain areas so white people could contain Black people to one area. And I thought this to be really interesting because it made me think about even some of the TV shows that I watch today and what they make Black areas seem like and what they call Black neighborhoods. You know, you're in the ghetto, you're in the projects, and just assuming that all areas where Black people live are riddled with gang violence, which of course is true at some times. There is gang violence in some areas, but not every area where Black people live is violent. And a lot of the times the areas that do have gang violence is a result of systemic racism and not a result of Black people being violent.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's systemic racism in a lot of society and the way our world works. And it's invisible to white people, I'm sure, because then the argument on the other end is that, you know, Black people are lazy. If they try harder, they could, you know, attain more. And it's so interesting because I read this book and I got to the Los Angeles section of the book and I was a little stunned, but also not surprised to hear that there were literal like laws that like white people would sign paperwork over and literally sign saying that they would not sell their house to Black people. And then I think the Great Depression hit, and so some white people were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, and so they did.
Yeah.
And there was one person I think she talks to in the book that they moved into their neighborhood, and the firefighter, I think the head fireman on the street, burned their house down.
Yep.
So,
and I also really found it interesting. I think it was a little bit earlier in the book, they touched on the same thing. And there was a mention of how the father in the family, a Black man, refused to leave the neighborhood and had a lot of pride, as a lot of Black men do. And it's understandable because imagine, you know, generations and generations of your people being enslaved and Black men being demasculated and being villainized and all these things, and the joy and pride that he must have felt to be able to provide for his family. And then a white person comes and tries to bully you out of the neighborhood. It's just, of course you're going to have a lot of pride there and not want to easily just leave. Like, of course you're going to want to stand your ground and fight for something that your ancestors have been fighting for years for.
And also you're given right. You bought the house. It's your damn house. It's your land. Like, you live there.
Like, are you going to pay my bills for me? Like, I'm paying the bills here. What's wrong with you?
And it's interesting, too, because it's not even like these Black people are coming in, like, trying to force themselves into your lives. They're just trying to live their life in their home on the land that they own. And you have a problem with that. Preach. And that just says a lot. And this is talking about years ago, but it's 2020 and this is still a problem.
Yep. And then getting into the conversations around police brutality and how it was such a big thing in LA. So even all these things are happening to Black people, the police don't care. Your neighbors burning up your house, they're doing all these things, the police don't care. And then oftentimes when police are called into these situations, who are the people that they look at to put the blame on? And it's the Black people. Yep. And I just, you know, that story about Rodney King getting beaten in the streets was really intense. And there was a comment about, you know, do you think that a riot like this would happen again? Because, you know, the beating of Rodney King caused a riot. I think there was over 1,000 people in the streets. And, you know, little did she know when she was asking that question and when she was writing this book in 2018, 2019.
2020 was going to hit and there's going to be a global riot.
Yeah.
And we're still fighting for those rights. And there's still people who don't understand that.
Yep. I mean, we're in the time where Breonna Taylor's murderers didn't get charged and convicted. I mean, they were charged, but...
He got charged for shooting into, you know, empty rooms or rooms adjacent to her apartment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the drywall's lives matter more than Breonna Taylor's, apparently.
Yeah, which is just...
Not surprised, unfortunately. I'm really not surprised. Like, exhausting. I mean, people blowing up on my Instagram about it, and like a lot of Black women that I follow, especially. But the general consensus around the Black women that I follow was we're not surprised. This has been going on for years. I think a lot of white people are now more aware of it. Maybe they're surprised, but welcome to what reality is. Yeah. And also back to the police brutality too. Is, you know, there's a lot of things that like, oh, you know, there's Black on Black crime and gangs and things like that. But in the book, she just talked about the fact that before these Black people migrated to Los Angeles, the white people just went and attacked people from Mexico, like people who looked like they were Mexican. Mm-hmm. So it's like, so who's the violent one? And also you put these Black people in specific locations, in specific neighborhoods. They can't come out of it because they have harder times getting jobs if they lose a job, or even finding a job in the first place. They live in neighborhoods that are decaying and are not being maintained. You won't let them move out of the neighborhoods. You won't let them move up in their jobs and gain money. You won't let them, you're basically regaling them to these small little areas. And so then eventually, yes, Black people did, come up with their own kind of like regions within their neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And that's part of where gang culture came from. But it's also because what else were these, like people, what did these people have? They didn't have a lot. You gave them like a tiny, 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 tiny dot amongst a huge ocean.
If you're constantly oppressing someone and you're constantly taking away their job opportunities, and no matter what they do, they never seem to be able to have enough income or quote unquote amount to anything. Of course, at some point you're going to turn to selling drugs and turn to other sources of income that are actually attainable to you, because unfortunately for a long time, the only sources of income that were attainable to Black people were involved criminal activity, and then they're deemed as criminals.
Yeah. And also, let's talk about the fact that when Black people did try to better themselves and move out of those neighborhoods, what did white people do? They burned down their houses because they didn't want them there, or they flew the coop. They moved because they were scared of Black people having money and having access and having homes and moving up and generating some sort of like wealth and bettering themselves, basically, which is a very, very interesting thing to think about, especially if you're a white person in 2020. Think about that. Another thing to think about, and the epilogue she talks about this, is the fact that history, and we mentioned this, is distorted through the white male gaze. Sorry, gaze, not glaze. But it's glazed with racism, so I guess you could say that. But you know what I mean? Like, it's just, and it's so true. Like, I think about all the white, amazing, quote unquote, amazing white men that I learned about in high school. And it's coming out, and in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, you've learned about the things that they did. Oh, that person actually had slaves, and that person didn't believe in abolishing slavery, and so did this, and so did that. It's like, so how great were these people?
Yeah.
And who determined that they're great? Oh, other white people? Well,
makes sense.
There you go. Answer that equation.
Exactly. Did you have any closing thoughts on the book?
One of my favorite books of 2020, and I think I'm on book number 35 right now. So like,
wow,
probably like top 3. I would say top 3, 100% top 3.
Ashley is an incredible reader. I read 2 books a month. I can't read faster than that, so I can usually do 2 books a month. But I
also feel like you have a better social life. Like my social life are my books. My books are my friends, and they don't even stay with me because I don't own them. They go back to the library. So my books are my temporary friends.
I go out maybe once every 2 weeks. I see my friends maybe once a month, and I only see my boyfriend. We hang out 2 times a week.
Yeah, I guess maybe I just feel like instead of doing anything else, I'm like, I'll just read. Like, instead of watching the Netflix, I'll just read. And instead of drawing or doing something creative, I'm like, I'm just gonna read. Like, it's just something that I can sit and do.
I do read every day. I just don't read very fast.
Yeah, I will say I read fast and I talk fast, so maybe that's why. But But yeah, no, 100% I would say go out and buy this book. I would recommend it to anyone, especially because it supports a Black female author. And given the racial climate this year, I was a little disappointed to see that a lot of books about racism and anti-racism that were being promoted were books by white people. So go support those Black folks. And in closing, I would say this will definitely give you something to think about afterwards. You'll definitely remember this book, and I think it'll probably lead to a lot of conversations with your extended family and family about history and about stories and about where you come from. And I think that knowing all that is just, I don't think it's necessary to know, but I think it's definitely adds to your life to know those things. So highly recommend it.
Amazing. Yeah, I would definitely recommend the book too. I really enjoyed it. I thought to close this off before announcing what our read 2 is, I was going to read the last page of the book to anyone who's listening. Okay, so I'm going to read it. It says, Mason Travail, a Black man whose family has been in California since emancipation, has said, "We are the promised land. The terrains of our bodies, though weary or broken, are not ruined. They are alive and fertile with dreams and possibilities and beauty. If we are the promised land, then that means that you, yes you, exist on a plane larger than your eyes can see. Home is wherever we decide to settle, but our truest base is one another. If we are the promised land, then what I want more than anything is for these oral histories to be the rain that awakens other people to bloom, to remember just how far our roots extend."
Can I clap?
Yay! So beautiful.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah, really. And the whole book was written like that. So if you needed any other reason to read the book, those beautiful words should give them to you.
Also, if you don't like reading physical books, like get the audiobook or e-reader, just do it. Just go read this book.
Right. So with that, let's announce what our second read is going to be.
I'm not even going to attempt to drum roll here, so just
so read 2 is going to be, do you want to say it?
Sure. It's going to be Abandon Me, and it's a memoir by Melissa Febos or Febos. I hope I'm saying that right.
Febos. I'm not sure either.
Yeah.
So Melissa Febos is an American author of Indigenous descent, and the book is basically about another book about connection to family and ancestry. So she discovers that her father had quote unquote Native American blood. I don't know if that is the correct way to say it, but that's what they say in the States. So her father is of American blood. And so she basically spends the whole book writing about her connection to her dad and learning the connection to her culture. And there's a history of drug abuse and addiction in the family, and her experiences with that, and her experiences with the type of family that she did get raised by, because from what I can tell from reading the cover of the book, it seems like she was perhaps raised by somebody who were not her birth parents. And so I'm interested to see what her story is going to be like.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for tagging along on our first book club pick and adventure, and I hope that if you've read the book, then this was an interesting conversation about it, and if you have not, this pushes you to go buy or rent this book from the library, take it out. Yeah, and we will see you, or I guess you will hear us in a couple weeks in our next podcast episode.
And don't forget to read 2 and read along with us, and DM us your thoughts. You can DM us at Instagram. We are at Cove Collective, CoveCollective. Oh my God, CTIVE.to. Is that right? That's so many
100%,
letters.
100%, that's right.
Yeah.
And also, if you like this podcast, please, if you feel free to and have the time to, rate and review us on whatever you're listening to us on.
Thank you.
Bye.